Hello, class. Today we are covering Aldo Leopold and talking about Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac. So we uh, we know that Aldo Leopold was born in 1887 and died in 1948. And in terms of education, Leopold went to Yale to study forestry, and his first job out of Yale was in 1909 as a forest assistant in southwest Arizona, and he also worked in New Mexico. So it was here where he began to pay heed to the ways in which we have an impact on the environment. So, specifically in terms of big game hunting and its effect on the environment. So, this led to thinking of the landscape as a living organism. Really, in his youth, he had a notion that the absence of wolves led to a hunter's paradise. And so later he'd reflect on this misguided notion, given that the interdependence of wolves in the overall habitat of deer and their territory is something that he re-evaluated in an ethical way. So in 1924, he got a job in Wisconsin and later became a professor of game management at the University of Wisconsin. And in 1936, he purchased land in Sand County, Wisconsin. And so there's not really a Sand County per se. This is more Leopold's reference to the sandy soils around the around the town of Baraboo in south central Wisconsin. So obviously, this is where he wrote a Sand County Almanac, all while settling his large family on 80 acres of land. And so to live and farm there. And his book wasn't published while he was alive. It was published shortly after his death in 1949. So interestingly, too, he died of a heart attack helping his neighbor put out a fire. So he was ethical to the end, for sure. So in the last concluding chapter from the Sand County Almanac, we have his reference to Homer's Odyssey, with reference to the nostos of Odysseus, his return home from Troy by sea. So the word nostos is the root word for nostalgia. In other words, this is characterized by going home, okay? And so the story is such that when he got home, he hanged a dozen slave girls suspected of misbehavior. And so in this sense, this was a way that Aldo Leopold was recognizing the way in which the young women were treated as mere property. And this is a problem in terms of the way in which we think of the environment as instrumental as opposed to having intrinsic value in and of itself. And so this serves as a metaphor for the way in which we think of property as disposable, and likewise how it is that how we see the environment as property, an object, and only as having instrumental value. So, in other words, we traditionally use and abuse the land in the environment as we see fit. So in the subchapter, the ethical sequence, we have Leopold's strong implication that ethics stand as a limitation of freedom in our struggle for existence, and therefore an ethic and ethics in general are a means by which we distinguish antisocial behavior from cooperation. In other words, egoistic antisocial behavior is the way that we are in our primary state of being, but then when we are ethical, we are looking at a more sophisticated way in which we are cooperating with others and likewise the environment. So this remarkable point has philosophical implications as much as having ecological significance. In other words, modes of cooperation bring about symbiosis. And so the word symbiosis is something from biology, and it has to do with an interaction of two or more organisms in close relation to the benefit of all involved, a mutually beneficial relationship. So at the time this was written, not too many people were thinking about a land ethic. And yet for Leopold, an ethic is a mode of guidance for meeting new ecological challenges. So for Leopold, one thing is clear: ethics in values, ethic involves individuals in relation to a community in an environmental way and in a communal sense in terms of people that we're living with. So, and it's a community of interdependent parts. Hence, our instincts serve as a rudimentary guide to mere competition, whereby our ethics should be brought about in the nature of cooperation, according to Leopold. Yet even the most arrogant egoist, the scientist, the entrepreneur, and the everyday person are all brought together in a biotic community, a biotic relation. So there's a point where Leopold references the ecologically problematic problems of plant succession with regard to Kentucky bluegrass as an invasive species. Even far back as 1810, when Daniel Boone was coming back to Kentucky after a decade in Missouri to hunt with J.J. Audubon, and to find his home of Kentucky unrecognizable with the grazable and invasive Kentucky bluegrass. So everywhere where there was once cane and savanna, Daniel Boone recognized Kentucky bluegrass, which is something that we don't see as all that harmful, but yet we could still see it as a way in which we are involved in the land historically. And this has significance, right? And so even the buffalo and the deer and the wild turkey have been replaced with domestic farming back in 1810. So even if the rolling hills of bluegrass with grazing cattle in a picturesque landscape is still for Leopold representative of land degradation, which for Leopold and us has less to do with what the land is and more with how the land has been used, right? Or better yet, how it's been abused. So curiously and philosophically for Leopold, this is not a plant, animal, or terrain problem. Rather, it's a relational problem, i.e., aiming and getting clear on the relations and how these work together in an intimate way in a biotic community is what we're thinking of as part of the land ethic. So in the ecological conscience section, subchapter, Leopold posits that the simplicity of relations between people in the land represents the value of conservation, when that is, we're in harmony with the environment. Yet, is the question of a land ethic having to do with just becoming more educated? Or do we also need to consider the ethical content of the education? Does education only enable us to obey the law, to vote, to join organizations, to work? In terms of conserving the environment, we might think that we just need to do things and the government will do the rest. We need to do these things and the government will do the rest. Aldo Leopold is urging us to do more. So back to the points on education, recall that Leopold wrote Sand County Almanac back in the 1930s, at a time where educational practices were not geared toward environmental conservation. In other words, there was little interest in bringing about an obligation to the land back in the 1930s. And so, for example, Leopold cites the problem of remediating soil in Wisconsin by the farmers in the 1930s, which is the practice of purifying and revitalizing the soil. And we discover, unsurprisingly, that they'll do things that immediately help themselves when the situation is voluntary, but not the larger whole, and not necessarily to the benefit of the land itself. So usually, land use ethics is governed by economic self-interests. In other words, obligations have no meaning without conscience. Now, in other words, we have to bring in conscientiousness before we start thinking about how economics is our only driver to do things in the environment. So, substitutes for the land ethic. So, of course, Leopold is focused on something we've all indicated over and over again as the total weakness of economic interests alone in our ethical thinking. Usually stand for a conscientiousness. So most members of the land communities are not linked to or given economic value and hence undervalued ethically in the process. This is in large part due to the lack of valuing of what's intrinsic and only valuing what's instrumental in the environment. Economic value is favored as a reasoning factor as to what gets our attention beyond the intrinsic value of what we ignore in the environment. So what gets ignored, right? And so likewise, as Aldo Leopold implies, the role of the land conservation is only to be left to government regulation, then we're in a sad state of affairs. So again, this is really Leopold's reinstatement that we are often lulled into a common opinion that economic interests and political interests alone are poor substitutes for a land ethic, and also for our environmental conscience all together. So what is Aldo Leopold's land ethic? We are good to revisit his famous quote, "A thing is right where it tends to preserve the integrity, stability, and beauty of the biotic community. It's wrong when it tends otherwise." And there, by a thing, he means our actions, right? And here we'll be wise to recognize that a thing is to be characterized as an ethical action, an ethical practice in the name of relating to one another and the environment, whereby our sense of ethical value for the environment would evolve to include the ways and practices in which we regard our relations in a community, and of course where the land and the and of course with the land and the environment. This is to be held in tandem with our activities of living and working off the land, i.e., we are not in opposition with the land, contrary to popular belief. Rather, we are in a symbiotic relation with the environment in all the ways we live our lives. In other words, we are already in a relation to the environment right now where we are. So the task is to appreciate and recognize the work and care for this communal relation. To be sure, we shouldn't disregard the importance of people in this relation, to translate into a mutual relation, wholly. We are no less important than the biosphere. So for Leopold, we are close, we are one with the earth, the animals, the plants, etc. And as we've noticed with feminism and the ethics of care, there's an emphasis on the care for Leopold that extends to our emotional involvement with the environment, to recognize and be sensitive to our mutual interdependence, which is important in terms of action, while at the same time, we need to accept and see that caring is also about receptivity, listening, and loving, to the degree that this is also emblematic even in our reception of the environment, our listening, our being in the environment. So thank you, and I'll talk to you later.